China has grown more powerful economically. It's turned a lot of that economic might into military might. And as you would expect, they're beginning to, throw their weight around. They're acting much the way the United States acts. As you well know, the United States has a Navy that has a significant forward presence, and we're constantly roaming around in the waters right off the coast of countries like China. This is just sort of the normal course of events for us. And what you should expect to happen is, as China gets more powerful, that it's going to build a blue water navy with a lot of power projection capability, and it's going to try to throw its weight around. It's going to try to send signals to the Australians, send signals to the Filipinos that we're in charge here. I think that's a misreading of the Chinese. The Chinese are not a status quo power. They want to dominate the South China Sea, and this explains a lot of what's going on with the Philippines. And they want to reduce American influence as much as possible in East Asia, and if anything, push the Americans beyond the first island chain, then beyond the second island chain. Well, I think it's important to emphasize that the Chinese are hardball players. They are interested in dominating East Asia, just the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. It's commonplace in this country to make the argument that it's the United States the source of all trouble in East Asia, and that the Chinese are basically satisfied with the status quo. And if the Americans would just back off, we could live happily ever after. I think what they're doing is they're asserting their influence in East Asia. I think that Trump has interests that go beyond Ukraine. I think Trump understands that there are a number of other security problems in Eastern Europe that need to be shut down. And that's why Trump is interested in this whole issue of crafting some sort of security architecture that covers Eastern Europe as well as all of Europe, if possible. I think both Trump and Putin want to put an end to the trouble that's been taking place in Europe in recent years. And that requires an overarching security architecture. So I think he has a lot of different reasons for wanting to end the Ukraine war. Now, you raised the issue of arms control and another START agreement. I think Trump is basically interested in an arms control agreement, but I think arms control moving forward is going to be an extremely thorny issue. And the reason is that we now live in a world where there are three great powers instead of two great powers. You and I are old enough to remember the Cold War and the great difficulty the United States and the Soviet Union had crafting arms control agreements when there were only two great powers in the system, the United States and the Soviet Union. Well, now you have three great powers, the Chinese, the Russians, and the Americans. And if you're going to craft meaningful arms control agreements dealing with things like strategic nuclear weapons or intermediate range nuclear weapons, it's going to have to be done with all three powers. And that's going to be very difficult to get agreement with all three. So I think arms control is going to have a very rocky future. I also think that Trump is interested in pivoting to Asia. I think that Trump has his gun sights on China. I think he's interested in containing China. And I think to do that, he understands that you want to pivot out of Europe to pivot toward East Asia. I also think he understands that pushing the Chinese and the Russians together, or to put it in slightly different terms, pushing the Russians into the arms of the Chinese by continuing this Ukraine war doesn't make any sense at all. So you have this rather unusual situation where it's Donald Trump who's talking about peace. He's a peace president. And it was Joe Biden who was the war president. And Zelensky and Biden were birds of a feather. And the problem that Zelensky faces is that he now is dealing with a partner, and I use that word loosely, in President Trump, who has a fundamentally different view on the whole issue of war versus peace. And what Trump wants to do is come up with a peaceful agreement that he argues, I think quite correctly, Trump I'm talking about here, will work to Zelensky's advantage or to Ukraine's advantage. It's funny, but I think both you and I agree that what Zelensky wants is not good for Ukraine. What Trump wants is good for Ukraine. The difference between Biden and Trump is just so stark. First of all, Trump is a much more forceful leader than Biden was. But furthermore, Biden was a warmonger, and Trump, for all his flaws, is not a warmonger. He's interested in shutting the war in Ukraine down, and he's not interested in starting any more wars. He's actually made that quite clear with regard to Iran, where the Israelis would really like us to take out the big stick and pound Iran. And he doesn't want a war with Iran, and he wants to shut this war down. This actually may work to cause Trump to call the Kremlin very quickly and to shut this one down as quickly as possible. You can tell a plausible story about how that happens. But I think the Russians are just sitting back and enjoying watching this. I don't think the Russians have to do anything but just sit back and wait till the Trump administration comes to them, and then hopefully they can cut a deal quickly, and that it doesn't get dragged out. That's what concerns me. I worry that the Ukrainians may be able to drag this out, in which case it would work to their disadvantage because they would just lose more territory and more people would get killed. Well, you want to remember that once Germany is on its own and Germany has to provide for its own security, it will think about the world much more differently than it does now, because now it has the United States sitting on top of it. Germany doesn't have nuclear weapons. What's going to happen if the United States leaves to Germany in the pursuit of nuclear weapons? Are they going to get their own nuclear weapons? Are they not? And furthermore, in between Germany and Russia, there is a lot of territory, and there's a lot of potential for conflict in that piece of territory between Russia and Germany, and a security competition could take place. So there are just all sorts of scenarios that are hard to predict that lead to big trouble. And what you want to do if you're a European is you want to head this trouble off at the pass. And the best way to do that is to keep Uncle Sam firmly enmeshed in the European security equation. I think they think that threat inflation is essential to keep their publics on board, and also as a way to maybe convince the Americans that the boogeyman is coming and that Europe needs help from the United States, much the way it did in World War I. There's an important economic dimension, but it's very important to understand that a large-scale American military presence in Europe serves as a pacifier. The Europeans like being subservient to the United States because the United States keeps the peace. Their great fear is not so much that the Russians are going to attack into Western Europe. Their great fear is that the Americans are going to leave and they're going to be left on their own. And they know what's happened in the past when they were left on their own. And it usually is not a happy ending. One is that Trump is deadly serious about putting an end to this war, improving relations with Putin and with the Russians more generally. Number two, you do not want to underestimate the amount of contempt that Trump has for the Europeans. And you also don't want to underestimate how anxious he is to greatly reduce, if not eliminate, our commitment to Europe. He basically thinks that NATO belongs in a museum, that it's not useful anymore. So if he had a serious opportunity to pull the United States out of Europe, or at least American troops out of Europe, he might just jump at it. There are three big issues here. One is that Ukraine has to be a genuinely neutral state. It can't be in NATO. There can be no Western security guarantees, which basically add up to de facto membership in NATO. Ukraine has to be NATO. Ukraine has to be neutral. That's point number one. Point two is that the West and Ukraine have to accept the fact that Russia has annexed those 4 oblasts plus. That's non-negotiable. And then you have the demilitarization point, which is non-negotiable. There may be some minor changes on whether they can have 85,000 troops or 90,000 troops, who knows? But that's just minutia. You want to remember that the demilitarization issue was one of the issues that was discussed in the Istanbul Agreement or Istanbul negotiations back in March, April 2022. So this is not new. And I believe that the Ukrainians had accepted the fact that they would have to demilitarize to the point where they did not present an offensive threat to Russia. So that issue is an old one. It's certainly still on the table. And the Russians are not going to compromise on that issue. The fact is that the Russians have a handful of demands that are non-negotiable. They have made that clear since June 14th of 2024, when those demands were clearly laid out by Putin. Now, General Keene's basic argument is that we can get the Russians to bend because we're in the driver's seat and it's them, the Russians, who are in trouble. This is delusional. The Russians are in the driver's seat. The Ukrainians are in desperate straits, and we are fed up with this war and we want to walk away from it. So Putin is the one who has all the leverage. So I think you're going to get the deal that Putin has basically articulated on June 14th and on a number of other occasions moving forward. And I think that Trump must understand very clearly what the Russian demands are, the main demands that I just described, and that he must have conveyed to the Russians that we will accept those demands. Otherwise, there's no point in Trump continuing to negotiate with Putin and continuing to talk as if we can cut a deal. So I think what Macron, Starmer, and other Europeans are doing is being very nice to President Trump and telling him that they will make certain concessions here and there. And this is the Europeans talking about making certain concessions on trade and issues like that, so they can stay in the good graces of President Trump and keep the American pacifier over their head. But on the issue of Ukraine, I mean, they surely understand at this point in time that Trump has decided where he's headed, and they're not going to turn that train around. Trump seems to be saying that if Zelensky doesn't agree, if he's going to, cause trouble and make the agreement unworkable, then Trump is going to pull us out. We're out of there, and he's going to leave it to Zelensky to deal with the Russians on his own, or maybe with the Europeans. And I think the belief is that the Ukrainians will quickly realize, and the Europeans will quickly realize, that they're no match for the Russians, and it's time to cut a deal. And if they don't, then Ukraine is going to be further destroyed. I think they understand that there's no way they're going to convince Trump to change course on Ukraine. It's got to be clear to them that the die is cast on that particular issue. I think what they're principally worried about, and it explains why they were so diplomatic, is they don't want to make relations between the United States and Europe any worse than they already are, because they don't want the United States to leave Europe. They don't want NATO to go away. I think the interesting question was the previous question that you raised is, what are we going to do if Ukraine doesn't cooperate? And you were also pointing out that even if Zelensky wanted to cooperate, it may be very difficult for him to do that, given the politics inside of Ukraine. But it's the real wild card here, when all is said and done, I think, is Ukraine. I've thought for a long time that once it became clear that Trump was bailing on Ukraine, that he was not going to continue to act like Joe Biden toward Ukraine, that would have significant psychological effects on the frontline forces. I used to say to myself, or I say to myself, how could it be otherwise? Yeah. You're losing with American support. You're suffering great casualties. And now the Americans are bailing on you. What's the point of continuing the fight? And then in that scenario, you could imagine the Ukrainian army beginning to crumble. So this could contribute to that for sure. But I do think that what will happen here initially is that I think many Ukrainians will feel good about the fact that Zelensky has played the role of the tough guy with Trump. Well, you could tell two different stories. One is that they will see this, which they obviously will. The whole world will see this. And they'll feel good about what Zelensky did. They'll think that Zelensky stood up for Ukraine and he stood up to Trump. And when Trump tried to browbeat him, Zelensky fired right back. So I think some people will feel that way. Maybe many will feel that way. We're talking here about many Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines. But on the other hand, one would think that they would understand, here again, we're talking about the Ukrainian soldiers, that this means that the United States is through with Ukraine. And at some point, it's going to cut off the flow of military aid. And that means Ukraine is doomed. And then the logic that you were spinning out begins to kick in. And that's to say, this is all hopeless. But what Trump wants to do is shut down the war as soon as possible. And that is in Ukraine's interest. It's not in Ukraine's interest to continue this war. And although Zelensky thinks that's the case, he's just dead wrong. He has no real option here other than to go along with what President Trump wants. And as you and I have said on countless occasions, actually what Trump wants is what's best for Ukraine. Zelensky doesn't realize that, and most Ukrainians don't realize that. So in a very important way, I think that what Trump wants to do is good for Ukraine. He's made it very clear that Ukraine cannot be in NATO, and there's nothing that Zelensky can do to change that.